I remember, I remember, remember. I remember, I remember. I remember, I remember, remember. I remember, I remember. I remember, I remember, remember. I remember, I remember. I remember, I remember, remember. I remember, I remember. I remember when we used to say fuck it and go some ways that we never been before. I remember playing Star Wars on Nintendo 64 up in the trailer park. I remember running the streets way after dark, playing hide and seek with the cars, pretending they were cops. Sometimes they were. I remember sitting on the curb, sipping on a Slurpee next to her and flirting. I remember hurting every time she had to go home. I remember calling every night, talking on the phone, and wake up in the morning hoping I wasn't snoring, just knowing I fell asleep. I remember dreaming of what we could be when we're old. I remember talking to our friends on the beach about how we planned to succeed, but in my mind I was thinking about planting my seed. I know that our roots could run deep. I remember I was only 15 and that didn't mean a thing. I remember I remember those days. I remember those days. I remember I remember those days. I remember those days. I remember I remember those days. I remember those days. I remember I remember those days. Those days. I remember being in my feelings and realizing we better live while there's still time. I wish there was still time. I remember your eyes right now as the summertime winds down, glowing in the moonlight, illuminated by the campfire. I wondered if you could read my mind. Did you share the same desire? I remember that you said you was tired and gonna head back to the camper, get a snack and relax for a while. I remember I smiled when you gave me a wink. I remember how wild we used to be. I remember rolling around in the sheets. Don't make a sound, we got to listen for the peace. Remember how free and limber. I remember how we started burning trees together, sipping drinks together, living like we down for whatever. As long as we're together, then we down forever. I remember I stole your North Carolina sweater, wore it every day until the letters wore away. I remember I remember those days. I remember those days. I remember I remember those days. I remember those days. I remember I remember I remember those days. I remember those days. I remember I remember I remember those days. Those days. I remember 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 I remember